Well, good evening. I think we need a sound man. Here we go. I think it's, yeah, there we go. Thank you very much. In the desk. I can't possibly compete with Steve's naughty jokes. Was it 3 weeks ago? When was it? Yesterday. Yeah, yesterday. Oh, strange, isn't it? But I can try this one for size. There was a pastor of a church who was asked by the leader of the youth group in the church whether he would speak at their meeting the following Friday on the subject of sex. But when the pastor went home and told his wife he'd been asked to speak, and she asked him what topic he'd been given to speak on, he became far too embarrassed to admit the truth. So he spluttered, they've asked me to speak on sailing. The meeting duly went ahead the following Friday, and it was a great success. Just so happened, the following week, the wife of the pastor bumped into the leader of the youth group in a supermarket. Oh, he said, we had such a good meeting last week. Your husband was marvelous, so good. Oh, she said, I'm so glad to hear that, because, to be honest, I was a bit surprised at the subject you gave him. You see, he's only done it twice. On the first occasion, he was seasick, and on the second, his hat blew off. So I won't ask you to vote. The subject I've been given this evening is a fantastic subject, actually. And if you can, we're going to do this at a canter, all right, because you're far too overexcited and far too full of sugar. And anyhow, some of you, your legs are aching from all that physical activity during the worship. So I'll be rapid. The New Testament, the subject is calling. Calling. Our calling. And the New Testament, I'm sure you know this, uses the word or the concept of call or called or calling a number of different ways. For example, the Bible talks of us all being called to Jesus. Called to Jesus. Which tells us a lot about who we are, who we be, as Linda was reminding us this morning. Hebrews 3 tells us that holy brothers and sisters who share the heavenly calling. Don't you like that? People sitting around you, we share, sitting next to you, we share a heavenly calling. Paul, in writing to the Romans, says, you also are among the Gentiles who are called to belong to Jesus. We're called, we're summoned. To you all in Rome, he says, to the Romans, again, he says, you're loved by God and called to be his people. Again, he's called, it's something we're summoned to. Romans chapter 8, you'll know this backwards. We know that all things work together for good for those who love him, who've been called to his purpose. So the thing we share in this heavenly calling is being called to his purpose. As a prisoner for the Lord, he writes to the Ephesians, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Now, it is something we've received. Something we've been given, absolutely, but that doesn't mean there's anything passive about it. And indeed, Peter talks about, my dear brothers and sisters, make every effort to confirm your calling. So it's a two-way street. It's a dance between us and the Lord. Jesus, just like Jesus did with his disciples, so with us. He calls us. He summons us to follow him. And in my early years when I was being discipled, I was presented, like many of you have, with the cross of Jesus, by which was meant that in following Jesus, I was in fact being called to die. That was very, very clear to me. The people who influenced me the most kept dealing with these big issues about my life and about my purpose and about the direction, all the things that God had chosen. There was a famous, so it's no surprise that a man called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a famous Christian, was executed by the Nazis in 1945, just towards the end of the Second World War. And he used to say this: when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. I've been crucified with Christ, says Paul. I no longer live. Christ lives in me. The life I live in my body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Being called to belong to Jesus, in the words of the English poet T.S. Eliot, is a condition of complete simplicity, costing nothing less than everything. So, before we go any further on the subject of calling, we are all called, all of us. Number one. Number two, we're called to Jesus, but the Bible also uses the word called, calling, in a slightly different sense, because arising out of being called to Jesus, we're also called to serve Jesus. Again, Romans chapter 1, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. Same to the Corinthians. Paul called to be an apostle of Jesus. So God calls us to be his servants, as he called Paul to be his servant. There's a man called Count Zinsendorf, you may have heard of, I think in the 17th century, 18th century, who started the Moravians, if you've heard of them. Do you know the Moravians had one prayer meeting, one long prayer meeting that went on for 100 years? He was a remarkable man. He used to say to his followers and his leaders, preach the gospel, serve Jesus, preach the gospel, die, be forgotten. How do you like that for legacy management? Preach the gospel, die, be forgotten. Sort of what Costa was saying earlier about the way we do church, that there's not ego in it. It's not really about us at all. It's about Jesus. So all of us, you see, what the point the Bible makes is all of us are called to serve Jesus and to do so for a specific task or a specific job or a specific role. Sometimes it's long-term, sometimes it's short-term. So the number of times you've come in here, this building, over the last 2 or 3 days, and there are the people around, quietly, they've got labels on, but they welcome you at the door, they feed you coffee, they cook lunch, they clear up lunch, they serve lunch, they clear it up, they clean. Then there are the sound engineers and the people who do all the the audio-visual stuff. People who make coffee. They've been doing this week something that God called them to do. It has the dignity. do you understand this? That before the foundation of the world, even before the world was invented, the Bible tells us that God planned, God called, well, you to this week and them to service. It's a phenomenal thought. It's a phenomenal thought. They were called to hospitality, I suppose you'd call it. So, if you're sitting here and you're a carpenter, for the sake of argument, you're called by God to serve Jesus in your carpentry. That's your high calling. You're a computer engineer. You're called by God to serve Jesus as you do all that stuff that none of the rest of us understand. It's called computer science. Or you're a social worker. Or you're a nurse. Or doula. You're a doctor. That's your calling. It's not just a job. It's your calling. You're a student. You're at school. Or you're at college or university, whatever you call it here. At this point in your life, you're called to study. That's God's highest and best for you at this point. You're a mother. You're a young mother, and you have got one or two or three young children at home. And your workplace, at least at this point in your life, is at home. Where once maybe you enjoyed a career of your own elsewhere, now you've experienced a career shift, I think they call it, and you're at home bringing up the children. Meanwhile, your husband's career flourishes only because you sometimes think to yourself of the biological necessities whereby he had the great misfortune to be born without a uterus or without ovaries. Poor man. But you need to be reminded that at this stage in life, God has called you to do that. Gives it a dignity. There's a wonderful story. You know the name Charles Spurgeon, don't you? Who was a wonderful Baptist preacher in London in the Victorian era, when Queen Victoria was on the throne. And there's a story of a woman who went up to him on one occasion and announced to him that God had called her to the ministry. But unfortunately, she added, she was married with 9 children. To which he replied, "You should be grateful, my dear, that God has not only called you to the ministry, but he has also provided you with your congregation." But he's making a very profound point. He's making a very profound point. You're part of the kids team, the leadership team of the kids gang in your church. You're called to serve God, to serve Jesus in that role. So we're called to serve Jesus, we're called to Jesus, we're called to serve Jesus. And because many of you here are leaders, let me talk a little bit about the specific calling, not a better one, not a worse one, but a specific calling of what we call being a Christian leader. So, and will you do that? Will you come with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 4? 1 Corinthians. If you can't find it, easiest thing is to look in the index or just hit search on your digital device. You've only got to hang around the vineyard for a few minutes to hear us. You've heard it tens of zillions of times, that being committed to Christ it involves also being committed to his church and committed to his cause. The Bible simply doesn't understand the concept of a Christian who isn't part of a church and part of his cause. It's nonsensical. It's like talking about boiled ice. It just doesn't make sense. It's like a rope that has 3 strands that, woven together, make the strength of what is real Christianity. So chapter 4. On this, what does leadership, what does the call to leadership look like? That's the question really I want to answer. What does it look like? And you may be a senior pastor of a church, wonderful, but you may not be. You may be leading just a couple in a small group on a Sunday. You've got 2 or 3 children in your particular age group, but you're leading them. It may be at work. You're part of a team. In your office, on your hospital ward, you're part of a team and you're leading them. Chapter 4, verse 1. So this then is how you ought to regard us, says Paul, as servants of Christ. Now remember, he's writing to a church, and part of the problem in the church was some of the leaders there had a hugely inflated view of their own importance. They were puffed up. They were what you might call, they regarded themselves as terribly important, sort of super leaders, super apostles. And they actually rather looked down on Paul as being somewhat substandard and unspiritual. So he plays, you have cricket in this country, don't you? Not that awful baseball. No, good. He plays it with a very straight bat. He says, this is how you ought to regard us as servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the mysteries God has revealed. Now, it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. I care very little if I'm judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I don't even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that doesn't make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait till the Lord comes. He will bring light to what is hidden in darkness and expose the motives of people's hearts. And at that time, each will receive praise from God. So just think the picture in your mind. Do you ever watch the BBC program? What's it called? Downton Abbey. Do you ever see Downton Abbey? And it's in a time in British history and social history when there was a clear demarcation between the aristocratic family and their servants. And there's a fellow whose name I forget. Who's the butler? Carson, thank you so much. Carson. So when you think of this, when Paul is talking about servants here, think Carson. In other words, it's somebody who's very competent, very well organized, and he takes on behalf of the master, the Earl of whatever his name is. On behalf of the Earl, he runs the house. That's the image here. So he's saying, as servants of Christ, we basically do this on behalf of Jesus. But it's his house, he's the boss, we serve him. And there are 2 things that he highlights here in this business of being called to leaders. First of all is accountability to the Lord, and secondly is faithfulness to the Lord. Those are 2 key characteristics of the calling of a man or woman to serve Jesus. He says, you see, in verse 4 and 5, ultimately Paul is saying, I am answerable only, that the servant is answerable only to the master. And what Paul is saying here, and here's it again at the end of verse 4, Eugene Peterson captures it. He says, "It makes very little difference to me what you think of me, or even less where I rank in popular opinion. I don't even rank myself. Comparisons in these things are pointless. I'm not aware of anything that would disqualify me from being a good guide, a good leader for you, but that doesn't mean much. It's the master that makes those judgments." So he's saying, look, Paul is saying, in serving Jesus, it is the Lord I am accountable to. At the end of the day, just take whatever job you're doing at the moment that God has called you to do in serving Jesus. Whatever it is, you fill in the blank. What Paul is saying is that at the end of the day, in the job that you do, you have been appointed by none other than God himself. Not by anyone else. It is God who appoints us, and therefore we are accountable ultimately to him. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not for a moment saying that God doesn't use the agency of human beings to employ you. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying beyond that, above and beyond that, your ultimate boss, my ultimate boss, is God. I'm not, just so you're crystal clear, I'm not for a moment saying that in ultimately being accountable to God, that we are somehow above criticism. I'm not saying that for a moment. Or that we should be insensitive to the opinions or the judgments or the critiques of others. I'm not saying that for a moment. Or that we're not accountable to one another and to our leaders. Or that we are in some way infallible. I am not saying that, because Paul is not saying that. Or in any way that I am exempt from the discipline of the church. If I go off the rails, it's no defense for me to say, well, I'm accountable to God. You know, I can take handfuls of cash out of the church accounts because I'm accountable to God. No. If I do that, I should be, far from exempt, I should be subject to the discipline of the church, if not the discipline of the law enforcement agencies. Do you see, it's quite the opposite. We are accountable to one another, but the point Paul is making is that ultimately, oh, thank you. You were very kind. Ultimately, we are accountable to him. And as a result, look at the result of this. Get this into your system. Get this into your head. It makes the world of difference, because it was as a result of this understanding that he talks about in the beginning of chapter 4, that Paul possessed an inner security, an inner stability that was dependent neither on human approval or human endorsement. That's not where it came from. You sometimes find people who don't have this. They run around, their leaders, and they want you to keep stroking them. Oh, pat me. Oh, I preached the sermon today. It was awful, wasn't it? And you say, no, it's very good. Well done. It was awfully good. You probably lied, but that's not the point. But you know what I mean? People who come and they're just begging you, pleading with you to stroke them and tell them they're all right and they're a good leader and maybe it'll be all right till tomorrow. Do you know? I'm caricaturing, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. Approve of me, congratulate me, tell me what I'm a great job, stroke me, pat me. Paul didn't need to do that. You and I don't need to do it. Because, no, deep down, he knew that God had given him the job. And that led to a great sense of security and confidence, in the right sense of the word. It gave him a degree of stability, because you see, it was born not out of personal vanity, nor indeed out of lawless independence. Well, I don't care about anybody else. but out of personal vocation, personal sense that God has called me. I've often thought to myself, and I think I've often said it, if I could, with leaders, if I could wave a magic wand over them, and as a result of that achieve one thing, do you know what it would be? Banish their insecurities. And my own, by the way. It's vital that we know that primarily we serve the Lord in the sense that God gave me this job. It belongs to him. He's lent it to me, and I will do it for as long as he chooses for me to do it. He's called me. He's handed it to me. And nobody can take it away until he does. It's a wonderful thing. It's such a relief. It makes all the difference. You say, I'm on the worship band. I play the keyboards on the worship band. Was it just they ran out of keyboard players, so they asked this nice young woman, whoever it was playing. Yes, there you go, you. Was that the case this evening? Not according to the scriptures. God gave you that job. And you did it beautifully. God gave you your job. God gave you your job and yours. And yours. Maybe I go on around the room. It is such a relief. Such a blessing. It means you can sleep at night. Faithfulness. The other thing I talked about, accountability, I also said I talk about a faithfulness. Look at it, verse here. They must prove faithful. In the end of verse 2, given a trust, you must prove faithful. You're not, as a servant of Jesus, a leader of Jesus, you are not required to be popular. That's not part of your job description. You're not required to be an extrovert. You're not required to be impressive. You're not required to be dynamic. You're not required to be educated. None of that matters. None of those are qualifications. But simply to prove faithful. Unglamorous. You see, leadership is usually unglamorous, often unnoticed, usually unheralded. Welcome to the gang. Just prove faithful. Just prove to be reliable. Well, I'm not very good at my job. Fine. Never mind. Prove faithful. Prove reliable. Well, there's so many people around, I'm so intimidated. Oh, shut up. Just to be faithful to the Lord and see what he'll do with you. You're someone who turns up on time. You're doing the coffee rota on a Sunday morning. You had a fun night last night. You ate far too much sugar. And whether or not you feel like it, you turn up. You roll out of bed and you're there. Do you know the definition of perseverance? It's the ability to carry out a resolution long after the mood in which it was made has evaporated. Stickability, I think they used to call it. That's what the apostle is talking about here. Oh, and it's such a wonderful thing to do that. And it's such a wonderful thing to see it being done. People are just reliable. They just do what they said. And they turn up. Well, you say, that's not very sexy. No, I quite agree. There's not much razzle-dazzle about that. But the Lord loves it. Then Paul moves on just a little bit. If we're talking about leadership, have I got another? They've got a few minutes. That clock is running fast. So the first metaphor or picture he gives us is of Carson in Downton Abbey, the steward, the servant. The second one, he has a whole lot of them. I haven't got time to do them all. He talks about an architect, he talks about a builder. Basically what Paul does is he walks into different areas of life and pinches ideas and word pictures from them. He'll go into accountancy and he'll deliberately pinch some words from the profession of accountancy to explain what he means about forgiveness and how God doesn't keep account and all that stuff. So he walks onto a farm. He talks about how he walks onto a building site and there's an architect. Here he walks into a circus. And he talks about a clown. Can we put back can we start again at chapter 4 and verse 4? Now, he begins, already you have, you already, no, verse 8. What did I say? Well, I'm so sorry, forgive me. My mistake. I meant verse 8. You should have known that. Already you have all you want. He's mocking them. You lot, you super apostles, you big shots. Here's just me, I'm just Paul, but you're in a league above me. And he's a little irritated, and he uses some ripe language. You'll see it in a minute. Already you have all you want. Already you've become rich. Oh, I'm so pleased for you. You've begun to reign, and that without us. You're now reigning the kingdom of God. Oh, how marvelous. If only I could do that. Tongue in cheek. How I wish that you'd really begun to reign so that we might reign with you. Oh, that would be such fun, wouldn't it? On he goes. It seems to me that God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like those condemned to die in the arena. Very, very quickly, in Roman times, the Roman general came back triumphant. He'd bring back all his captives and all the booty, and they'd have a huge procession in Rome. Right at the end of the procession were right at the end was the opposing general who'd been defeated. And they had this big procession, and then he was publicly executed. So they were the sort of idiots at the end of the fodder for the guillotine, or how else they executed them. Do you see? And he said, that's what we apostles are like, us real apostles, Paul and Barnabas and so on. We have been made a spectacle to the whole universe. People are laughing at us and mocking us. You are. You Corinthian apostles. Spectacle to the whole universe, to the angels as well as to human beings. We are fools for Christ. We're idiots. We're clowns. For Christ's sake. Oh, but you're so wise. We are weak, but you're so strong. You see what he's doing? He's undermining them. He's mocking them for their arrogance and their pride. You are honored, we are dishonored. To this very hour. Then he gets real. He said, let me tell you about leadership. Let me tell you about real leadership. To this very hour we go hungry and thirsty in our case. We are homeless. We work hard with our own hands. When we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we are slandered, we even answer kindly. We have become the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world, right up to this moment. And he's talking about leadership. And any of you who are called to any form of leadership, and many of you are, take note. They don't talk about this a lot in the books on leadership, but don't ever forget it or ignore it. Please. In that last verse, second half of, could you put up verse 13 again? Thank you. There are a couple of words there. Do you see? He says, we become the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world. Now, I have to tell you that no translation from the Greek, which is this was written in, from the Greek into the English, no translation has yet been honest with the text. The two words, they're cousins, very closely related. They have the same root, which literally means off-scouring, off-scraping, yes? So, for example, if you were to take a piece of kitchen towel, you know, like a sort of elephant loo roll, you know what I mean? You know, a big one in your kitchen. You take it and you put a bit of water on it and then go around to the far end of the kitchen, you know, underneath, and just wipe this cloth along the floor. And you turn it upside down, and what have you got on there? You've got a few dog hairs, some dust, a dead fly or two, a shrunken frozen pea that never got into the saucepan. You know what I mean? Every kitchen has frozen peas hidden away, yes? Am I making sense? Okay? You've got all that on your white cloth. That's the word he uses here. Is translated scum of the earth, which is hopeless. But that's what the word means, the off-scouring, yes? Now take the other word, its first cousin, which is translated garbage of the world, which is pathetic, cowardly. Because you've seen little babies wandering around. Ask any of their mothers about a thing called a baby wipe. Do you know what it is? It's a sort of scented tissue, yes? And let me put this tactfully. If you were to use a baby wipe for the purposes for which it was invented, are we tracking? Good. When you use it, and what ends up on the top of that baby wipe, usually brown, that's the word that Paul uses here. Human feces. The word, well, in our part of the world, it begins with C and ends in rap. Or it begins with S and ends in hit. But I didn't use either word. But okay. That's how, just grasp, that's how leaders can be treated, says the great apostle. Don't you love it? Don't you love it? It's so real. It has traction. Oh, some of you look at me and say, I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm treated like raw sewage too. Yes? And we laugh about it because it is funny, but on the other hand, when it's happening, it's not at all funny. You know, have you ever thought to yourself, maybe you've daydreamed in your bath, oh, what would it like to be a Dave Peterson or a Mike Pilavacci or the Pope? Oh, I could get used to this, you know, all the publicity and all the high profile. Oh, yes, I think I'm made for this. Paul says, let me tell you what this would mean if you were. Humiliation, exhaustion, deprivation, poverty, injury, hard labor, verbal abuse, in fact, untreated raw human excrement. This is the Bible, ladies and gentlemen. This is not some self-help manual or some pity party for leaders. No, it's part of the deal. You fancy being a Christian leader, Paul says? Well, that's what it's all about. Don't think church leadership is anything glamorous. Don't envy the pastor or the evangelist or the national director, his job, her job. You know nothing of the struggles he or she endures. You know nothing of the insults he or she bears. You know nothing of the opposition he or she suffers. You know nothing of the inner weakness against which he or she struggles. You know nothing of the constant demands he or she has to meet. You know nothing of the security that he or she has had to sacrifice. Until you've done it, you just don't know. And that's not to create an elitism, do you understand? I'm not trying to glamorize this, but I'm not any more than I'm trying to say, you know, there's an elite that suffers, to make you lot feel rotten. They're going to suffer a bit more so you feel really bad. No, we're not doing any of that. We're just saying, just flat out, open page, this is what it is. Don't you love the Bible? Don't you love Paul? It's just so real and honest. And you see, the problem was in the church in Corinth, some of them at least had an exaggerated, romanticized, idealistic view of leadership. And that'll only lead to one thing, that is disillusionment and or burnout. Even today, we have a tendency to make celebrities out of some of our leaders. And then we're surprised when they crash, because human beings aren't designed, physically we're not designed to take glory that belongs to God. We just can't do it. So we better shuffle it off and give it away. Truth is, a great many Christian leaders are or have been overworked and overstretched and subject to what these days we'd call abuse. They've never had time to wallow egotistically in their fame. They were far too absorbed with surviving the rigors of their ministry. That's why Paul says, look, the name of the game here is humble, sacrificial service. We're here to serve. It's the most liberating thing. It's the most wonderful thing, the most wonderful privilege. The cost involved in being a leader is sometimes being seen as odd, eccentric. I mean, how many times have you been out with a group of people who don't know you and are not believers? Ellen and I sometimes play a game at a dinner party where they don't know what we do, and we can see how long we can go without actually lying, how long we can get through the dinner party without admitting to what we do. So what do you say? What do people say? Oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm in salvage. Do you see? Or I'm in life insurance. Do you know? And it's not a lie, it's just not the answer. It's economical with the truth. But because once they do know what happens, the temperature drops. You what? How could you possibly be so ... So ministry is not always plain sailing. We do encounter difficulties. There are disappointments. There are setbacks. There is criticism. There is misunderstanding. Yes, there's even mockery, like a clown in a circus being laughed at. The two of us, we've probably had the worst. I mean, in all honesty, I'm going to start to cry. In all honesty, we've had the worst, 13 months of our entire lives. Starting with the sudden death of Eleanor's sister 13 months ago. And it's just been, again, the details don't matter, but it's just been horrendous. We've had an awful year. And we're still standing. God is still on his throne. You'll hear about that tomorrow morning. Listen, look, I ought to shut up, oughtn't I? Oops, yes. Let me just finish one thing. You'll love this. This is a man called Archbishop Ramsey, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury about 5 back. Bald as a coot, shiny pate with tufts, tufts, but white hair above both ears. He was a brilliant theologian as well as a wonderful archbishop. And he published a collection of sermons to young men then who were going to become ordained. We call them ordinands, sort of, potential church planters, as it were. And he said 5 things, then I'll shut up. Is that all right? Thank God often and always, he says. Thank God carefully and wonderingly for your continuing privileges and for every experience of his wonderful goodness. Thankfulness is a soil in which pride does not easily grow. that beautiful? Second, take care about your confession of sins, which is his slightly liturgical high church way, but you and I know what he's talking about. Confessing your sins. Be sure to criticize yourself in God's presence. That is your self-examination. And put yourself under the divine criticism. That is your confession. Number 3, do not worry about status. There is only one status that our Lord bids us to be concerned about, and that is the status of proximity, closeness to himself. Don't you love it? Number 4, be ready to accept humiliations. They can hurt terribly, but they can help you to be humble. There can be the trivial humiliations, just accept them. There can be the bigger humiliations, and all these can just be so many chances to be a little nearer to our humble and crucified Lord. And the last one, you're like this. Use your sense of humor. Laugh about things. Let me read it again. Use your sense of humor. Laugh about things. Laugh at the absurdities of life. Laugh about yourself and your own absurdity. We are all of us, infinitesimally small and ludicrous creatures in God's universe. You have to be serious, and we're all dead serious in what God's called us to do. You have to be serious, but never be solemn. Because if you are solemn about anything, there is a major risk of you becoming solemn about yourself. And from that, good Lord, deliver us. Why don't you stand up? We're going to pray together, and I apologize for the time. Will you forgive me? You've got to, haven't you? You're Christians.